their group is being replaced or that their group is being undermined. And that gives birth to phenomena like the Trump phenomenon in the US, where Make America Great Again is an idea very much about making a particular kind of American great again. And in the UK with Brexit, there was this whole, in a sense, desire for this older, less diverse Britain, without all these Pakistanis and Indians and Nigerians and Poles and Slovakians, but especially, I think, Pakistanis and Nigerians. There's a real crisis. But it's not just happening in the West. You see it in other countries. In Modi's India, the idea of a kind of true Indian and what Hindutva really is. Erdogan's Turkey, or Xi's China, or Putin's Russia. Almost everywhere there's this story of the dominant group is somehow threatened by other groups. They're somehow being diluted. And I was very curious in particular about this idea of, the feeling of being under threat as white people in a place like America or Britain. And in fact, recently what we've seen with the Gaza conflict, the horrors being perpetrated on Gaza by Israel, again, you're seeing this sort of narrative of, the Palestinians are somehow a threat, and just speaking up in support of Israel is somehow a threat. And so I thought, one thing that fiction can do, instead of looking at these things from the outside, is to look at them from the inside. That we can put on other people's skin and see what that feels like. And so I thought I would like to put on the skin of a character who feels like, in a sense, their whiteness is being lost, that their position in society is changing, that who they are is being transformed, and to see what that felt like, and in fact to do it with as much compassion as I possibly could. So in a sense, the novel is a story of Anders grappling with what it's like to not be white, but it does so from a stance that's actually very sympathetic in a way to Anders. Not necessarily agreeing with Anders, but sympathetic to Anders.
In the novel, there's a particularly shocking scene in which Una's mother, that Una is Anders' love interest, she vomits when she witnesses Una and Anders together, a white woman with a dark man. The powerful and deeply unsettling image of the mother, and I quote, heaving and heaving with her eyes wet and her nose wet until her stomach was empty, close quote, forces readers to confront the deep-seated discomfort and disgust that some white individuals express about interracial relationships. So, you talked about sympathy and empathy. This is how did it feel in particular to write a scene like that? Is there a toll that it takes on you to write these kind of characters? Because Anders and Una have their faults, but the mother, you also get inside her head, and she's a very florid racist. So I just wonder what that whole experience was like.
Well, I'm no angel. I think that, we're human beings, and there are parts of each of us that are quite despicable. There are things that we do that are terrible, whether that's acting out of anger, whether that's racism, whether it's treating someone over whom we have socioeconomic power or some other kind of power in a terrible way, whether it's, other kinds of biases. I don't think anybody in this room could really claim to be completely immune from these horrible aspects of what it is to be a human being. And I think many of us, if we were to be judged by the standards of society in 100 years or 200 years or 300 years, and they ask, how we could be comfortable with living in such an economically unequal society, or how we could be comfortable killing animals and eating them, or how we could be comfortable denying movement to people based on nationality, or whatever the standards of the future will be, we will all be found wanting against those standards. And so, for me to imagine Anders's mother, who is, as you say, a racist, is, not such a big stretch. I may not, in a sense, partake of her beliefs, but to imagine having strange beliefs and to understanding where they come from. So, in a sense, Anders's mother is confronted by the dilemma of time. Each of us, as we get older, starts encountering a world that looks less and less like the world that we grew up in. And then we have a choice on how to deal with that. Well, a number of choices. And some of us will choose to sort of become deeply embittered by that, and to try to go back to what we've lost. It's not such a difficult to understand thing. I mean, here in Pakistan, we may not have race in the same Western sense, but a good friend of mine, a Ghanaian friend, told me that he visited Pakistan and he found, some of the most racist encounters he ever had. So we aren't, some group of angels sitting here, and if you switch from race to gender, or if you switch from race to religion, we see everything in Pakistan expressed that we would abhor in a racial construct. So I guess what I'm saying is that it was less for me damaging to myself to write Anders's mother, and more an attempt to understand who might she be. Why would a human being be like this? What would motivate her? And in many ways, I think what motivates Una's mother is a feeling of loss. She feels that her husband has died. She feels that her town is changing. She feels that she's becoming economically precarious. She's old. She's unwell. Life is slipping away. And so she looks at her daughter and imagines somehow this future and this youth can come through her daughter, and part of that future and that youth is racial identity. And so she clings to that. Now, the way she expresses that, many of us might find abhorrent, but the feeling of clinging to something, of trying to find meaning in this way, is important to recognize, because unless we recognize the desire for that, and then think, how else might we meet that desire? If all we are telling people is just don't feel this, we're not going to get anywhere. But if we say, look, I can understand your feeling of loss, and I can understand your feeling of dislocation, and I can understand how you feel unmoored. Let's look for moorings together. It seems like a more optimistic direction than simply to dismiss, that response. And so, one thing which novels do is novels blur people. When you read a novel, you're not yourself. A reader is not just a reader. When you read a novel, you're sitting by yourself and you have inside your mind your thoughts, but you also have somebody else's thoughts, and those are the thoughts of the writer. And in that moment, you are this strange hybrid person who has their own thoughts and somebody else's thoughts in them at the same time. You're yourself, but not yourself. Something very strange is going on. And I think the same applies to the creation of characters, that one can be oneself and not oneself when one tries to imagine being another person. And I think that is a very fertile thing, because it allows us to blur what we might think and what we might imagine and find new things. And that, I think, is why we have art in the first place. And one of the reasons is because we need to find new things. There's sort of two paths open before us. Either we descend into greater and greater tribalization. We see what's happening in Palestine, we see what's happening in Ukraine, we see what's happening all around us, in Karachi and Lahore and India. And we say, okay, well, let's have a battle of all against all, and we see which groups are strongest. Or we try to imagine a different way forward. And so if we're going to imagine a different way forward, part of that imagining is to get inside the skin of other people. And so that's, in a way, what the book is trying to do.
And that's a great answer. And just to say a bit more, because you pointed to loss as one of the main factors in Una's mother's descent into this world, which to some extent she does pull herself out of as well. Another factor is how much online she becomes. And this is something you've talked about in the previous novel, Exit West, as well. You are, and in some of your essays, you are interested in what this digital world is doing to us. And the other thing that was ringing bells for me is that there is evidence to say that people became more online and more radicalized during the pandemic. And though you never use that word, in a way what you're portraying in The Last White Man is this pandemic of brownness. And you have in an interview called Anders patient zero of this disease. And there are people trying to use drugs like ivectomine, potions and things to try and get rid of the disease, and then it sort of blows over. So there's a lot of parallels, though COVID is obviously never mentioned. And so I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about your thoughts about disease and quarantining, and did you have the COVID-19 pandemic in mind when you were writing?
So I wrote the book during COVID, and in COVID, strange things happened, right? The world was different. Suddenly, all flights were cancelled, and at least in Lahore, we weren't allowed to leave our houses, and we couldn't go, we were stuck at home, and the restaurants were shut, and the shops were shut, and it was a very strange rupture. And it was also funny to see it coming from a distance. You first read about it, and you hear about it, and then now suddenly the flights to Pakistan are closed, and then you hear maybe it's in your city, and then somebody you know might have it, and then somebody actually is very sick from it, then maybe you get it, it's sorry, I get thrown off when people are talking in the same room. And so the novel, in a sense, is like that. It's something happening from a distance and coming closer. People are changing color; they're becoming different, and that sense, like a pandemic of things spreading, was very much, I guess, part of the book. So the book was a reaction to the pandemic. It's also a reaction, of course, to the digital world that we live in, because right now, I was born in 1971, so I encountered, the internet really around the time I was probably 20. I got my first mobile phone when I was 26. I got my first computer, in my teens. So I grew up in a pre-digital world. And I'm an immigrant in this world of social media and mobile phones. My children are natives, but I'm not. And what you see when you have grown up in a different world is how strange the digital world is. The digital world, the machine world, is a world of sorting. Ones and zeros, this and that. And because it's a world of sorting, it, by its very nature, polarizes. You are either, this thing, or you are that thing. You're good, or you are bad. You are black, or you're white. You're Muslim, or you're this. It is making us, sorting us into increasingly hostile tribes. I think one of the aspects of digital culture really is the We have certain instincts and tendencies, and they get heightened and heightened and heightened, and we start coming apart as society. And so the novel is very much about that. What if that breaks down? If machine language is the sorting of humans and everything else into zeros and ones, and if we are now becoming super sorting creatures, we recognize and sort, as an example of this, I'm 52 years old, but it was only recently that I had friends who began to stop speaking to each other over politics. Do you like the PTI or do you not like the PTI? I mean, it's kind of an absurd, after 40 years of friendship to say, I want nothing to do with you, you're ridiculous, it's over. Because of are you pro-PTI or anti-PTI? But it's fascinating that issues have taken that kind of salience, that we can look at people we've known our whole lives, and over an issue of political party identification, we can decide that this person is no longer part of our group. And this happens in area after area after area in our lives. It's as though we meet people and we say, okay, I have this in common, I have this in common. This is not in common. Then you're not like me. That's incredibly dangerous, I think, for human society. And so the question is, how will we culturally build antidotes to this sorting mechanism? And for my part, exploring a novel where the sorting mechanism breaks down, where you can't tell if somebody is white or dark, where race is impossible to categorize, was exploring that notion, and opening up the door to thinking, how else could we stop sorting each other? How else could we resist the overwhelming impulse to sort people into categories?
And since you've brought the novel in quite rightly, and I'm aware that my questions have been very focused on content till now, but in fact what I find so interesting about your writing is the form, which is different but linked each time. And I'd noticed that in Exit West you were playing with the long sentence, and I've asked you about this before in London, but you didn't write fully in long sentences, but in The Last White Man it's almost completely uniform, where each paragraph is a single sentence.
Yeah.
So could you talk a bit about that stylistic choice, about the marriage of the content, the ideas that we've been talking about, with this very interesting, and sometimes, it's like creative writing 101, and you yourself are quite succinct, naturally. Like, put a full stop in, but you didn't in this novel. Why?
So, I actually have foolishly, I rushed to the airport, so I've left my bag in the car, and my Last White Man is in the car. Can I borrow somebody's book? Can I borrow your... I see. Okay. So this is what the book sounds like, and this is how it works in terms of, sentences. Okay. One morning, Anders, a white man, woke up to find he had turned a deep and undeniable brown. This dawned upon him gradually, and then suddenly. First as a sense, as he reached for his phone, that the early light was doing something strange to the color of his forearm. Subsequently, and with a start, as a momentary conviction that there was somebody else in bed with him, male, darker. But this, terrifying though it was surely impossible, and he was reassured that the other moved as he moved, was in fact not a person, not a separate person, but was just him, Anders, causing a wave of relief. For if the idea that someone else was there was only imagined, then of course the notion that he had changed color was a trick too, an optical illusion, or a mental artifact, born in the slippery halfway place between dreams and wakefulness, except that by now he had his phone in his hands, and he had reversed the camera, and he saw that the face looking back at him was not his at all. That's how it begins, and that paragraph is basically one long sentence. And the reason why it's written like that is that there's a number of reasons, but partly the novel, it just keeps sort of dropping forward. Like music, writing is made up of, music is made up of notes and pauses. And writing is made up of words and pauses. And the types of pauses that we have in writing are given to us in different ways, but one of the very important ways is through punctuation. Each mode of punctuation that we have indicates a kind of pause. So a comma is a pause as you still are running forward. It's a slowing down. A semicolon is a pause that sort of still leans forward. A colon is a pause that's about to jump forward. A full stop is a pause where you actually take a stop for a second. Now, in this novel, the idea is that we keep getting into these strange ideas. And Anders is thinking, the novel goes inside Anders' head and Una's head, other characters' heads. And they're thinking something, and they're like, well, maybe not that, and maybe it's this. Maybe not that, maybe it's this. And I think that is how human beings actually think. We have, in a sense, been recently trained to imagine that we think the way that we post on social media. But the way we post on social media is nothing like how we actually think, because a social media post makes permanent an idea. You say the election was rigged, for example. If you were to say that, that's then your view. Now, that's a pretty easy one because I don't think too many people would argue that that was not the case. But if you take something slightly more, ambiguous, you'll find that you say something and then you start thinking about it. You say, well, do I really think that? And maybe I do, maybe I don't. Most of our lives we are spending thinking something, playing with it, discarding it, and thinking something else. But in a sense, when we freeze that statement as a message, as a text, as a social media post, we have to commit to it. We have to say the thing I said yesterday is still completely true. Oh, you disagree with what I said? Well, it was right. We can't sort of say, well, I said this yesterday, and now that you mention it, maybe it was a pretty stupid thing to say, and I actually don't think that now, and I think, we are robbed of that. So the novel wanted to give the characters and the reader the flexibility of changing their minds. And these long sentences that are built of commas that are continually moving forward limit the amount of times that you stop. And so you encounter an idea in Anders' mind or Una's mind or the narrator, and you don't have a chance to interrogate it, really. You have to go to the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing. And by the time you reach the end of this long sentence, you've already, in a way, accepted something that happened a long time ago. So that's partly it. The other part of it, of course, is that long sentences let you set up certain rhythms and cadence in language. And those rhythms and cadence are very important because part of the way that writing convinces us, if we disagree with what somebody's saying, part of the way they can convince us is because the musicality of how they say it creates certain rhythms. We learn to anticipate those rhythms, and we accept the sound of things. So if you think of Martin Luther King's, I have a dream speech, or any great oratory, often what's happening is a certain rhythm is set up in language, and then the listener begins to be almost hypnotized. They become sort of musically inclined with that rhythm. And the next word is the right word, and the word after that is the right word, and so before you know it, you are nodding along with the words because each is the right sound. And you are open in that moment to accepting what is actually being said. And that's why good speech writing and good oratory is different from a lot of other prose that we see. So the novel is, of course, trying to do that, and so it has these long sentences that do this, this sort of thing. And I think the last part of it is that we are living in a time of compression, where attention spans are sort of shrinking and where we are constantly distracted. And long sentences are a way of resisting that. You kind of are stuck with this sentence for a minute, and you have to sort of stick around until it reaches the end. And hopefully that sort of mesmerizes the reader into a different headspace than something where you can stop and be distracted and stop and be distracted. I don't know if that works, but I certainly was thinking about it. I thought I would write a very small novel with very big sentences. So it doesn't take too much time to read if you don't have much time. But while you are reading it, it asks you to be focused on it.
I've been here for a month, sort of by accident, and I've taken the opportunity to be learning Urdu. And what you're describing is a bit of my experience because of the subject-object-verb structure of that wait. To my ears, there's a lot of waiting for the action because I'm used to subject-verb-object, where you know what's happening in the sentence quite early on in English. And it's reminding me of German that I did at school, which was the same kind of thing. And I just have to tell a quick joke. Where there's a woman, she's going into the supermarket, and there's this guy orating, and there's a bunch of people around him. So she sticks around for a bit, but she can't really get the hang of what's going on. So she goes and she does all her shopping, comes out, and the guy's even got a bigger crowd, and he's still going on. So she goes into the crowd and says, what's he talking about? What's going on? And the guy goes, oh, he's German. We're just waiting for the verb. Sorry. So in a way, reading your novel feels a bit like that. But also I like what you're saying about embedding uncertainty and pushing against that sort of digital binary yes-no opinion and this forward-pointing comma thing. And since I picked up on that you were starting to experiment with that for the first time in Exit West, and then you really commit yourself to it in The Last White Man, where is this pointing you next? I mean, do you think you could keep going with these long sentences?
I don't know. Each book is built to answer a particular question. And in a sense, these long sentences really, for me, began in How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia. The last sentence of How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia is pretty much a page. And like this. And I think that was a natural evolution for me. But whether the next book will also be long sentences, I have no idea. For me, form follows function. And there's this question of like, what is a book trying to do? Why do we even need books? What's the point of writing one? It's clear that at this moment, television and screen stories are the dominant ways in which mass-produced stories get communicated. And in my own lifetime, I've witnessed what seems to me like a change in the position of the novel in the culture. When I was starting out, the centrality of the novel in the culture felt more. It seems to me less. Now, that's the way of things. The epic poem is not what it once was. Humans change, culture changes, and the forms for that culture change. But as somebody who likes novels and is invested in novels, and that's what I do, there's a question of, well, what kind of novel can do things that are necessary, that make it worth writing and reading, and what would that be? So a lot of what I've tried to do is I've tried to write in very conscious reaction to film and television. So film and television are fully imagined for you. A novel is just characters and spaces on a page, and you imagine that into existence. And so the role of the reader is very different from the role of the viewer of a television show or a film. A reader is creating much more. A reader is a co-participant in making a book in a way that a viewer of a film and TV show, of course, they are creating meaning, but it's not on the same, I think, scale, not the same degree. And so then, for me, the question becomes, okay, what do we do with this? So what I've done is I've, in a sense, written novels that leave more and more space for the reader to imagine, where people don't have names and places don't have names, and there are big unexplained gaps where the reader can imagine what they want to imagine, where things aren't described fully. my novels have become almost like screenplays for the imagination of readers. They're not like screenplays, they almost dispense with dialogue entirely. They don't describe scenes in quite the same way. But they are the same way that the screenplay is a catalyst for the making of a movie. I write books that are a catalyst for what I think a novel is, which is something that readers make. Now, what does one do from here, and what is, it sort of depends on what the problem you're trying to solve for is. I was trying to get a grip on Pakistan and my sense of this place with Moth Smoke. And then on 9/11 and the sudden rush to judgment and otherization of Latin fundamentalists, and then moving back to Pakistan and the complete, crass commercialization and elevation of money as the supreme value in Pakistan that happened somewhere between my childhood and my 30th birthday in How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia. And then migration and the backlash against migration in Exit West, and race and belonging and the loss of those things, and age and aging and loss in The Last White Man. Now, what the next thing will be, I'm not 100% sure, and what it requires in terms of how a novel can be written, I don't know. But that's what's sort of interesting to figure out, which is, how do you write a book that does something that only books can do in a way that is of value to you as a writer? It's worth a few years of your life, and a value to a reader. It's worth a few hours of their time. I never know the answer to that question until I begin doing it. So will it be long sentences? Will it be unnamed? Or will it be something completely different? I don't yet know.
I really liked your summary of what each of the novels are trying to do. If there's a common thread through them all, it seems to me that one of them might be about work, especially what it means for a man to work, about unemployment or addiction, about losing everything, gaining everything. And even in this novel, I think it's less there, but it's still there. And it's for both genders. You've got Una as a yoga instructor, and you've got this masculine world of gyms. So you're kind of going quite deeply into actually white beauty myths and things. But there's still this issue of work. So I wonder if you could just say something about that, because it keeps coming back.
Well, I'm interested in work. It's what most of us spend much of our lives doing, whether it's paid work or unpaid work. But most people spend most of their day working in some form. And just like I've lived about half my life in Pakistan and half outside, I've lived, half my life working and half sort of writing books. So I'm kind of halfway in and halfway out, and I'm fascinated by the world of work. As a novelist, you sit all by yourself in a room for a few years, and you come out with a book. It's a very strange thing to do, and so it's almost exotic for me to watch people go into offices and go into, my wife runs a restaurant, or my sister is a university professor, and sort of see them going to their jobs, and they do their thing. And I once did that too. I still dabble in things from time to time. So I'm fascinated by the world of work. I think that we treat it as normal when it's so strange. Partly what a novelist does, I think, is to make strange things that we have convinced ourselves are familiar. Work is utterly bizarre. And Anders and Una, in a sense, have typical, you could say, tasks, professions, yoga instructor and sort of, gym employee. But those are fascinating jobs because they are both labor jobs. They aren't, in a sense, office jobs. You aren't producing some spreadsheet or Microsoft Word document or Google's Docs thing. You're working with your hands and your body to make things, or working with people. And yet, you're not making anything. In a sense that the labor doesn't result in a carpet or a shirt or a basket or a dinner or a house. It's fascinating to think of how so much of labor is now, in a sense, labor engaged in changing something about our identity, how we look, how we feel about ourselves, how we move. And so in that sense, to me, Anders and Una are laborers in a very interesting new world of labor, where so much labor is stuff like this. As you say, partly it's about beauty myths, and not just white beauty myths. I think they're almost universal beauty myths. When I, watch my kids' TikToks, and my 11-year-old son, asks me if he has abs, it's clear that all over the world, people are seeing, these sorts of things and reacting to them. And in a way, it's not surprising, because we're animals. We are like cats and dogs and leopards. And we are animals that have been displaced outside of a kind of natural animal environment to such an extent that we have to rethink everything. We have to rethink predation. How do we catch and eat our prey? We go to a shop and we buy it, most of us. How much of it should we have? What should we have? And then, the body that we have so that we could, gather berries and tubers and catch rodents and whatever we used to do. We now don't need to do those things. So what do we do with that body? How do we maintain it in such a way that it looks like it could, catch something or lift something? And this situation that we found ourselves in, where we are divorced from our animal reality to such an extent that we now have professions that, in a sense, are reanimalizing ourselves in workplaces like gyms, is very interesting to me. And so it's also, of course, for those who work in those professions, a particularly fraught labor environment, because, at least if you are a bricklayer, you can say, well, as long as they make houses, I can lay bricks. But when you are in the business of, let's say, keeping people fit, and the economy is on hard times, how much do we need people to keep us fit? How much will they pay to keep us fit? What if you can get fit watching a YouTube video or something else? It's very precarious. So anyway, I thought that these types of jobs were interesting to give these characters. Because one other thing which has changed for so many people over the march of generations is how precarious work has become. As each generation, it seems, has a more and more precarious idea of what a job is. How do you make a living? Can you continue to make a living? Does anybody owe you anything in making a living? What path do you follow? So Anders and Una are grappling with exactly those kinds of questions.
I used to be a Zumba instructor, so this bit really spoke to me.
There you go.
And
yet you're not now.
Well, the other thing that happens is what happens when the gym's closed by law, and you do talk about that in your book. Let's open it up now, because I know you have to rush to the airport, and I'm sure the audience has much more interesting questions than I do. So I don't know if there's a mic, but yeah, what are your questions for Mohsin Hamid?
Hello, hi Mohsin, Zara here. So my question actually was the sentence one that you asked so beautifully, and it was answered so well as well, but I just wanted to add how pleasurable I found it, because it's not easy. It's not easy to pull off page-long sentences without some kind of grammatical slips, but you did it beautifully, and it really felt like a flow, like going through I loved that part, and it really did keep my focus, where pauses give you that opportunity to take, so many numerous breaks while reading. The other question I wanted to ask you was the name. So I noticed that you didn't name any of the other characters. They were just the relationships to the main characters. So, their names were irrelevant, I felt, in a way. But the main characters, Anders and Una. So typically, Anders is quite a whitish sounding name. Una, you could say, okay, a more African sounding name or more Swedish sounding name, but did you put some thought into their names and also making the others nameless? Was that a deliberate, I mean, just any comments on that would be great.
Yeah, no, thank you. You know, it's funny because the namelessness was part of leaving it for the reader to set the book where they want to set it. It was so funny that, you know, I would go to like Sweden and they'd say, well, you set your book in America, and I'd go to America and say, well, you set your book in South Africa, and, you know, you'd go to Britain and say, why did you set your book in, like, you know, Germany? And sometimes people would think it was set in their country, but often they would imagine onto the book a setting. And I wanted them to be able to imagine onto the book a setting. The names give you a slight anchor, and only 2 characters have names, as you say, Anders and Una. Now, Anders is interesting because Anders, it means sort of stranger. It also is a root of man in different European languages. And so there's something, you know, about a stranger, about a man who's strange from himself, whatever. The connotations were interesting. And Una, you know, again, is a name that you see in the Balkans. You see it in sort of the Baltic area. You see it in Ireland, oddly enough. It pops up in different places. And both of these names, they felt like, you know, they came from some misty, primeval sort of whiteness, you know, that out of this strange, distant past, you know, with the club and the loincloth and, you know, bear skin would emerge, sort of Anders and Una. And they just were a feeling, really. A feeling, and they're sort of strange names. So it could be somewhere in Minnesota, and it could be somewhere in rural Finland. I mean, who knows? But oftentimes, I guess what I try to do is just to create a slight feeling, like with these names. In Germany, interestingly enough, because their Anders really does read as, you know, as other, you know, the stranger. People read the book in translation very much as, you know, as the man becomes the stranger to himself. And so it had a very interesting, you know, and in Dutch, something similar happened. So people would read it, and they would read into the name a great deal, whereas somebody in Pakistan might not read it quite that way. But it doesn't, there's not one way to read the book. But I guess what I would say about that, the last thing I'd say about it is that sometimes you just give the reader a little nudge with their imagination, and then they can go someplace. Like in The Reluctant Fundamentalist, I gave Cengiz a particular way of speaking, a particular accent and voice that was very formal and sort of old-fashioned in a way. And that was how the novel created a feeling of Muslimness around Cengiz. Because otherwise, Cengiz, he drank, he had sex, he didn't pray. Nothing obviously Muslim about the guy, except for kind of tribal identification, but he didn't behave in a particularly religious way. But because he spoke in a particular way, readers could read onto him a Muslimness just because he sounded Muslim to them. Because in their imagination, his voice was a Muslim voice. And similarly, these characters, hopefully, potentially nudge the reader into a kind of space of original whiteness that they can associate with this situation, which they may or may not do, but that was where the names came from. So as far as other characters not having names, as I said, you know, the difference between books and films. By not naming the characters and not naming the place, you have to imagine them as you want to imagine them. You know, somebody called mother could have your mother or your friend's mother in them. Somebody called father could have your father or your cousin's father or whatever. So I think names bring a kind of hyper-focus to a character. By not having a name, you slightly blur the focus, and the same way that with your eyes, if you can't see quite clearly, you will imagine what you're seeing. The same thing happens with names. You imagine a character into existence if it's not overly defined for you.
Any other questions? At the front?
Hi, I'm Sada. Actually, just going back to the name idea, you mentioned Cengiz and the Reluctant Fundamentalist. So when I was reading that book, another friend of mine was reading it at the same time, a white American lady. And she read his name as Changes in the whole book. And she said to me, you know, it's a very interesting name. Is this a typically Pakistani name? Because why is it changes? And I thought that was very interesting. Is that something that you had consciously thought about?
You know, I hadn't thought, it did come up afterwards. I didn't realize that anybody would think of Genghis as changes, but
She
of
read
course,
the whole book as changes.
a lot of people did, strangely. I actually didn't realize it, before the book came out, or around the time the book came out, it was the French translation. And they said, look, we can't name him Changer or whatever, right? Because it's too obvious. I said, what do you mean it's obvious? They said, well, you know, he's Changer and he changes. And I said, oh, wow, that is. So they did it Chenguiz, Tchenguiz in French. So which is, I think they use that as a, you know, Genghis kind of a spelling. That's when I thought, oh my goodness, you know, people are going to, and you're right, many people did think he's changes and he changes. So that was unfortunate. I didn't want to be that, I hadn't thought of that reading, but that's what happens oftentimes.
I actually appreciated the spelling too, because I really dislike the G-E-N,
Yes.
you know, spelling, because it's not at all how it's.
Well, it's not how we pronounce it.
Exactly.
I don't know how they say it in Mongolia, but yeah.
Anyway, thank you.
Thanks.
And I love your books. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for a wonderful session. I really enjoyed your take on the language that you use, specifically in terms of the long sentences. You know, I was wondering about that. My question was about you know, the last two books. They have this hypothetical sort of a situation. You know, The Last White Man, where the color of the skin changes, and the one before that, Exit Pest, where these doors open up. So, I mean, is this, I mean, would you say that this is the genre that you're engaging in, at least in the last two books, is magic realism? Because it almost feels there is this like magical element, and then there is all of this reality that is sort of like, you know, sort of like woven around that this one very pivotal magical incident. And I've read all, I think, of your other books as well, and I don't think you've been working specifically with these sort of like these hyper imaginary, hypothetical situations before that. So I was wondering if that's like a trend that you're going to follow for your next books as well.
No, it's a great question. You know, people have called them magical realism. I don't know if they're magical realism or not. I mean, I like science fiction. I don't know if my books are science fiction, but I've always liked sci-fi as a kid. Who knows? I mean, that's for, I guess, readers to decide what category the books fall into. But your bigger question is about reality. And actually, you know, I am not convinced that reality is real. In fact, I don't think that it is. So what do I mean by that? I mean that, you know, for example, you know, this chair feels solid, but we know it's not solid, right? It's mostly empty space, and it's sort of atoms scattered across vast distances, like stars in the sky. But it holds itself together, and so we say that it's solid. And like this, you know, thing looks white, but it's not white, right? There's no such thing as white. White is the way in which my brain tells me that light of a certain wavelength is reflecting off an object. Every color is that. And I have no way of knowing if Claire and I look at these jeans and see blue, or if what she thinks of as blue, I would think of as green, or whether I would think of it as the way a turnip tastes, or, you know, I mean, we have no way of knowing. We know that we can both say this is blue, but we don't know if what we see when we see blue is anything like what somebody else sees, right? I mean, maybe what Claire sees when she sees blue is what I hear when I hear a baby, you know, laughing or something. Who knows? And, you know, the Sufis will tell us that it's only through love that we can sort of transcend a belief in a unitary self, and that we can feel our connection to the whole of universe. And psychologists and psychiatrists will tell us that, you know, if you put somebody's head into a functional magnetic resonance imaging system, you will discover that many things that they imagine that they are thinking are actually things that follow on from biological processes that they are not aware of. So I think that I'm deciding to do something, but it's entirely possible that what I call deciding to do something is an explanation I give to a biological thing that's happening. In other words, I'm kind of like a reptile that does stuff, and then I say, oh, the reason I did this was X, Y, or Z. Now, I'm saying this because I think that reality is something that we've sort of forced ourselves into. We all agree to pretend that everything around us is real. And then sometimes things happen and we suddenly realize that it's not real. You know, somebody close to us dies. And suddenly reality doesn't exist. It's like, this can't be real. This is a complete rupture in my sense of reality. Or a pandemic comes and reality suddenly shifts, right? So in all of my books, what I've tried to do is to slightly crack reality. To have something that looks real, but is also recognizably not real. In Maud Smoke, there was a trial, which couldn't have happened like that. You know, all the characters come, Dara and Aurangzeb and Mumtaz come and tell you the story. You'll get this, you know, memo on air conditioning. That couldn't really happen. Their stories are real, but the form is unreal. Same with the Reluctant Fundamentalist. You know, it seems like a real story, but, you know, would two people really sit and have a conversation like that? It's a very stylized, almost theatrical one-man play version of a conversation. In How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia, again, it's realism, but no historical time passes in that book. A young child grows up and becomes an old man, and in the beginning of the book there's CDs and computers and automobiles, and in the end of the book there's still CDs and computers and automobiles. No historical time passes, even though 70 years in somebody's life has passed. This is my reminder to not get late for the airport. So weirdly enough, all of those books also played with reality. The reason why I think it struck people that Exit West and The Last White Man played with reality is because they played with physics and chemistry. You know, suddenly somebody's skin changes, or somebody who stepped through a door into a different world. And so, in a way, the breaking of reality became more visible in those books. But I personally don't think of them as such a departure. I think all of the books broke with reality in a certain way. I don't know how the next book will do it, but, and this is probably a good way to end our conversation today, is that I think that we recognize that we are making ourselves up as we go along. We recognize that our life is slightly a game of pretend, that I'm pretending to be Mohsin and you're pretending to be Claire, and you guys are all pretending to be whoever you are in your lives, and we are going through life sort of making it up. We know this is going on. We know that reality is something we're kind of inventing as we go along. Our personalities are things we're going on, our characters. We could just leave home and never go back, but we choose to go back. And so we're inventing this life story. But when we pick up a book, we know that it's made up. We know that it's something fictional. We know it's, and that somehow is comforting. Because we, who spend our whole lives pretending that reality exists, get to stop pretending for a few hours. Get to embrace an experience that clearly isn't reality, and yet still has a real emotional resonance for us. And that's what I think is interesting about books, and that's really what I try to do. But thank you all very much. Thank you.